We're living our truth now. Crystal, what?
Krista who?
Christadelphian?
Did you say Christian Dolphin? So are you from Philadelphia?
Welcome to the Life After Leaving podcast, an ex-Christadelphian podcast. Hello, heathens, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Zinnia. Today's episode will be the last episode of Season 3, and we'll be closing with a fun little history episode today. If you've listened to the podcast before, you know that I was raised in the Christadelphian faith, but I left as an adult and became an ex-Christadelphian. After leaving, I discovered that I enjoy history. So in these history episodes of the podcast, I dive into my historical research to explore Christadelphian history from an ex-Christadelphian perspective. As always, anyone is welcome to listen and learn something new, but please be aware that this episode is geared towards people who are not Christadelphians and who are open to hearing information that is not specifically geared towards supporting the Christadelphian ideology. And yes, I know I still owe you the rest of my research into John Thomas's medical career, but that episode's going to require a lot of time to finish, which I just did not have while the podcast season is underway, since I'm the one doing logistics, recording, editing, promoting, and everything else. So in lieu of that, I want to share this mini history episode about one of my favorite Christadelphian stories that I've come across so far in my historical research. And what better time to talk about this than during a season commonly associated with magic, Christmas time. So today I'll be sharing with you the story of a Christadelphian ecclesia that became enthusiastic practitioners of hands-on energy healing. And for anyone who isn't or wasn't a Christadelphian, that's really shocking for us ex-Christadelphians to hear, because energy work and hands-on healing have never been part of the traditional Christadelphian faith. I mean, Jesus could do hands-on healing, but that's pretty much it. If you wanted to heal yourself, you could pray about it, you could visit your doctor, but that's basically it. I also have a hunch that most of you have never heard this story before because it comes from an incredibly obscure resource, so I'll also share a few history tidbits from that source during today's episode as well. So I found this energy healing story tucked away in a 3-volume history series written by William Norrie, the brother of Robert Roberts' wife, Jane Norrie. These history books are about the development of the Christadelphians in Britain, and more specifically, about the first ecclesia in Edinburgh, and they were entitled The Early History of the Kingdom of God in Britain. And just as a technical note, this is before the term Christadelphian was invented. So I'll be using the modern term Christadelphian, but just know that that's not the name they were technically identified by at this time in history. So if you want to know the historically accurate name for the Edinburgh Ecclesia, you can find it on page 128 of the first PDF of this history series, where William writes that the meeting was called, quote, "The Edinburgh Church of Baptized Believers of the Gospel of the Kingdom of God," unquote. And that is a mouthful, so Christadelphian is what I'm going to use today, because for once, that's the short version. And this is another fantastic find, because it's actually pretty cool to hear about the formation of an ecclesia in the early years before all of the traditions and culture that we would recognize today were firmly established. This particular ecclesia in Edinburgh, Scotland, was founded way back in 1853 with just 24 members. And while they did not meet in a barbershop bathroom like some other early ecclesias did, as I mentioned in the Robert Roberts episode, they did have some unusual decor in their first meeting rooms. Apparently, the original hall that they rented was decorated with 2 guns. Williams said that, quote, "The most striking feature in this ancient hall was supplied by 2 rusty old guns, which occupied a conspicuous position over the principal window. The appearance of these warlike weapons suggested a further paraphrasing of the well-known lines, 'They hang the musket in the hall and study war no more.' Such was the quaint old hall in which Edinburgh Church commenced its meetings," unquote. Nice. Classic Christadelphian love for symbolism. Already there. Okay. So to get back to explaining why this history book is so obscure, that is because these books are literally rare. In fact, there were only 10 copies ever published, as they were only intended for private circulation. And fortunately for me and all of you listeners, there are websites that host digital copies, and according to these websites, only 3 of the 10 copies are still known to exist. And once again, I'd just like to thank archivists everywhere because this podcast relies on their hard work. Without someone making a digital copy of this and the other extremely niche old books and journals I reference, all of this historical information could have been lost or just at a minimum be inaccessible. And that would be really sad because this story is kind of my Roman Empire, actually. And I think the fact that these history books were intended for private circulation makes them even better because they contain a lot of honest, personal details that maybe wouldn't have made it into a polished publication for a widespread audience. In particular, something that sticks out to me is it has a lot of criticism about the Christadelphians' golden boy, Robert Roberts. This is significant because in my research, I occasionally find references to people or ecclesias who are speaking out about an issue with the early Christadelphian influential leaders. And yes, to reiterate, it was usually fellow Christadelphians disagreeing with something or trying to assert more autonomy for their ecclesias. There are even instances where Christadelphians have tried to make their own magazines to compete with the Christadelphian magazine, for example, such as the Manchurian, which Peter Hemingway mentions in his History of the Christadelphians. But since in most cases, those prominent Christadelphians are the ones writing and archiving their history, and they have the means to continue the official Christadelphian magazine, which was funded in part by John Thomas, that dissent and those other perspectives in Christadelphia are usually not republished, and those competing publications are not preserved and available to read. So that's kind of frustrating because often we end up having a record of just half of the debate. And let's be honest, reading only rebuttals is not as interesting without first reading the argument and being able to hear their responses. So this series of history books by William Norrie offers a rare instance of being able to hear basically the other side of the story of Christadelphian history. And it's told from the perspective of those who did not silently obey everything that Roberts and Thomas said. And I have actually alluded to this before in the history episode about Robert Roberts, and I'll just remind you about that real quick because it does give us some background information on the Edinburgh ecclesia. So in Robert Roberts' history episode, I mentioned that Robert Roberts married a woman from the Edinburgh ecclesia named Jane Norrie in 1859. They evidently had a long and happy marriage, but there were some family troubles because Jane and Robert cut off her entire biological family just 8 years afterwards in 1867. And I'll share a quote again from Robert Roberts' autobiography about what he said was the reason for the split. Roberts wrote, quote, "It was a real trouble of mind to me to have to break with the professors of truth in Edinburgh. A number of circumstances had combined to give them a large place in my affections. It was from their midst that I obtained the best of God's mortal gifts to man, an excellent wife. Among them I got my first lessons in ecclesial and literary work. Themselves, one and all, I esteemed and loved as a company of excellent people. The chief disintegrator lay in the animus shown towards Dr. Thomas, who I venerated with an ardor that time has not diminished, and next, in the little interest taken in the truth which he had been instrumental in recovering from sectarian darkness, and which formed the ground and the sole ground of my enthusiastic attachment. And next, in the various oppositions to both points of truth advocated by him, and to a hearty policy in such part of the truth as they admitted." Unquote. And it's interesting but sad to note that Roberts felt that he had to break from his wife's family and ecclesia because he also says that he loved them and that they were excellent people. And it kind of sounds like present-day Christadelphians who cut off their ex-Christadelphian families. Like they might say they love you, but they love the truth and John Thomas more. And unfortunately, Roberts is one of those people who set that example because everyone in his circle had to revere and believe what John Thomas preached, or that was it, and he had to break from them. And evidently, their family in the Edinburgh ecclesia were believers, but they didn't agree with everything that the doctor taught and believed. So Roberts decided he had to cut off all ties with them. And I won't get into all of the differences in belief at length today because that whole thing is better saved for an episode talking about the splits. And today I want to talk about energy healing stuff. But I do want to share one shocking story from this history book before we get into our main story today. So here's part of the story from the recollection of the members of the Edinburgh ecclesia, which happened in 1860. Quote, The talk was at times very animated, and in its course Robert Roberts, with great warmth, laid down the proposition that the restoration and exaltation of Israel was the very essence of the gospel, and no one could be properly baptized who did not understand that. I demurred to this extreme statement of the matter, but Robert insisted. If that be so, I said, I could mention several members of the Edinburgh Church who did not believe so at the time of their baptism. Who are they? Well, we need not go so far to discover them, for one was your own wife. She did believe that when she was baptized. No, she didn't, but I tell you she did. And I can assure you that she did not, because she and I were both baptized about the same time and had pretty much the same amount of knowledge, such as it was. We have often talked over the matter since, and wondered whether our apprehension of the things of the kingdom was such as to render our baptism quite valid. We were troubled with doubts about it, but as the result of our many talks, we always fell back upon what Paul wrote to the Corinthians. There were some among the Corinthians who said there was no resurrection of the dead, and we invariably came to the conclusion that, as there is no mention of the apostles requiring persons who were ignorant of so important a doctrine as the resurrection to be reimmersed, no defect of our faith was so serious as that, and so we allowed the matter to rest. Then she shall be reimmersed so soon as I get back to Huddersfield, said Robert most decisively, and he kept his word. Unquote. Yeah, I love that William published this exchange between him and Robert Roberts, because you can really see that black and white thinking on Robert Roberts' side compared to the Edinburgh ecclesia, which had this solid scriptural explanation for their perspective, and they allowed a little more nuance around baptism and what it meant and all of that. But Robert Roberts basically just screams, it's not good enough, instead of calmly and rationally discussing why he feels that other Bible verses back up his perspective, or something more reasonable and less authoritarian. And again, it's a little bit culty for a church leader to handle things that way and not listen or even try to understand other perspectives. Because instead of speaking to other members as equals and trying to critically think about his beliefs, Roberts just gets emotional and reactive, as recorded here in this instance. And also, he starts just making decisions for his wife while she's apparently not even there. So also, rude. And it's kind of crazy to hear Robert Roberts declare that he will force his new wife, because yes, they'd only been married for a year at this point, to be baptized again. Like, I thought baptisms were supposed to be self-initiated. And this is also interesting because John Thomas said that his wife was baptized again and it was her choice after reading the scriptures. But like, I kind of wonder if John Thomas also just screamed at his wife, just like Roberts forced his wife to be rebaptized. Like, what was the real story around that? And just as a quick background, this incident is the result of actions started by John Thomas, and it's well documented in Robert Roberts' biography of John Thomas, Dr. John Thomas, His Life and Works, and it's also recorded in Peter Hemingway's book. Essentially, Dr. Thomas was accused of preaching Anabaptism by the Campbellites, and he replied by basically being a smartass and saying, it's not Anabaptism, because that means rebaptism if you look at the roots of the words. I'm advocating for re-immersion. Like, oh my God, John Thomas. Both are immersing a previously baptized person in water for religious reasons, so just stop being annoying about it. Plus, his re-immersion was literally called a rebaptism, and even Peter Hemingway uses that term in his book, so we're all calling bullshit on that. But Thomas is quoted in his biography as saying, quote, such objectors need to be taught the first principles of the doctrine of Christ, for assuredly they who plead thus against re-immersion never knew the truth. Immersion is not baptism, neither is re-immersion rebaptism, if they can possibly understand the difference, unquote. As usual, John Thomas was being a jerk, saying anyone who disagreed with him never knew the truth. And as he developed his doctrines, his beliefs about what constituted a valid baptism changed. At first, it was anyone who was baptized without an understanding that Jesus' blood cleanses our sins and that Jesus was resurrected did not have a valid baptism. Okay. But the story I just shared with you from William Norrie is years later. And now Robert Roberts is saying, oh, anyone who didn't believe in the restoration of Israel at the time of their baptism didn't have a valid baptism. So the requirements of how to have a valid baptism were changing dramatically over time. And again, this change in the standard for baptism happened after John Thomas himself was rebaptized for the third and last time in 1847. Peter Hemingway records it this way, quote, "The initial impetus was his reading the article entitled The Hope of the Gospel, which drove Dr. Thomas to the realization that the gospel could not be preached without including the setting up for a future kingdom on earth," unquote. And again, I love how John Thomas got all his ideas from other people, and yet people still believe he came up with this theology on his own somehow. And Peter Hemingway even shared other sources here. Peter Hemingway wrote, quote, "It is sometimes disputed as to where exactly Dr. Thomas derived his views on the promises to Abraham and their essential nature in the future kingdom on earth. He acknowledges his debt to the Anglo-Scotch Baptist William Jones, but was at the time also in contact with others, one such being Nathaniel Field, who had held similar beliefs for some years," unquote. What an original thinker John Thomas was. So basically, John Thomas kept taking new doctrines from other people, and then he would make a big deal about them. And then Robert Roberts would force the community of followers to adhere to these changes and adopt them. And so this changing the standard for what a valid baptism is was understandably fucking annoying to their baptized members. Anyone who remembers sitting in meeting with wet hair after their baptism will tell you how annoying that would be to be like, oh, I have to do that again because some guy just changed his mind on whether I'm good enough. Awesome. But just know that this idea of rebaptism was basically what also split John Thomas from the Campbellites, because they got really pissed when he started rebaptizing people and making them jump through these hoops and changing things in the community. So it's not that surprising that that topic was also causing fissures within his own community of followers as well. And honestly, let's just try to picture this happening in the present day. Imagine that like a really prominent brother who is not a member of your ecclesia, not a member, just decides that everyone in your ecclesia, again, that he doesn't even attend, needs to be baptized again because he says a specific doctrine is essential now. I think there would be a lot of pushback from baptized members of that ecclesia. I mean, this Scottish ecclesia had been formed 7 years earlier and consisted primarily of baptized adults. These were regular members who started their own ecclesia themselves, while Robert Roberts was only 14 years old at the time. And these grown adults had been putting their own money into running their meeting, renting rooms, doing their services. And now Robert Roberts is 21 years old. He shows up and starts telling them they're not good enough because John Thomas changed his beliefs, and now everyone has to do something new. Like, she doesn't even go here. So from this version of events, it also seems like Robert Roberts was the one who initiated the animosity with this ecclesia that he later split from, where he had to split from them. Roberts was the one who brought this up in this instance. He's the one changing the criteria for what it means to be a baptized member in good standing because Dr. Thomas said so, rather than using the Bible. And then Roberts was getting really emotional and bossy to force everyone to accept the changes he wanted to see instead of even listening to other perspectives. And you might be thinking, but Zinnia, it was just his wife and his household that he was worried about. Nope. After this exchange, Robert Roberts literally asked William to send him a list of names of everyone that William thought didn't meet Robert Roberts' standards for their baptism, because Roberts planned to force all of those people on the list to get baptized again to make them acceptable to fellowship with. Little controlling. Also, as an aside, someone in the Christadelphian Facebook group shared a message they had received from a Christadelphian that said something along the lines of, we should be open-minded, and I'm sure John Thomas and Robert Roberts would agree with me. And what I was just sharing with you, these examples, I think highlight a lack of tolerance for differences and the strict black and white thinking that these men embodied. Because both of the early founders, specifically Robert Roberts here with the Edinburgh ecclesia and John Thomas with the Campbellites, did not tolerate any ideas which they deemed to be in opposition to the truth as stated by John Thomas. So yes, being open-minded is generally pretty good. I don't disagree with that. But adding on to this claim that the early Christadelphian leaders were really tolerant and open-minded to other perspectives is just not based on the historic records we have, in my opinion, from what I've read. And this is just one example of them both not being able to tolerate a difference of opinion, actively trying to stamp out differences, and refusing to compromise or listen and value other perspectives. So, in my view, Roberts kept choosing to cause sparks and then fan those sparks into a fire. And there were other issues that happened later before Robert Roberts disfellowshipped this entire ecclesia in 1867. The rebaptism issue was just the beginning. But Roberts always placed the blame for this split on the Edinburgh ecclesia. So when you actually hear their version of events, since they did record it in these books, it really changes the narrative around what happened. And unfortunately, these sorts of splits also set the precedent for countless other Christadelphians to cut off families or ecclesias after they also set an extreme standard that they then expected other people to meet. The Roberts family could have chosen to continue to love and interact with their family. And you know what? Maybe you choose not to break bread together if you really feel like being snooty about it. Okay. But at least have a relationship with them as people, as family. But instead, their demands for other people in their family to conform to their beliefs is what ultimately broke apart this family, in my view. And the Edinburgh gang were honestly my kind of people, because there is sass in here too, in how they handled the situation, or at least I'm reading it that way. So one kind of sassy quote that I found was, quote, "Are we always to be immersed over again every time we get more light on God's precious truth?" Unquote. As well as, quote, "What is baptism into the kingdom but a conceit of Dr. Thomas, utterly without foundation in Scripture? I call on him or his admirers to bring a single command or example for baptizing anyone into the kingdom. I believe none can be produced. Baptism into the kingdom is Dr. Thomas's institution, not Jesus Christ's. Well worthy of a man wishing to be a leader of a party, but unworthy of any disciple of Christ." Unquote. Like, dang. Robert Roberts is going to need some ice for those burns. Whew. And for someone who is claiming to be setting up a church based on the Bible, it's probably not good that Roberts wasn't presenting a scriptural basis for his views. And coincidentally, he was adamant about a belief that John Thomas was adamant about. I sure think he sounded like a admirer of John Thomas. So I think that whole story about the baptism drama around Jane Norrie and the rest of the ecclesia gives you a little taste about this ecclesia, their sassy response. And I also feel like it shows that William Norrie was an absolute legend by quietly publishing this comprehensive history of the ecclesia decades later in 1904. And that's just a small taste of the drama that was happening in the early years of the Christadelphians in Britain, as Robert Roberts attempted to wrangle all of these different groups of people in these ecclesias around the world into one cohesive religion whose followers met the standards set by Dr. Thomas. Organizing religion required a lot more force than most people realize or want to believe. And those are the sorts of goodies I find tucked away in these old history books. And this reiterates what we already knew and discussed in the Robert Roberts and the Christadelphians history episode in season 1. As Roberts set out to organize and preach to the ecclesias, he insisted that they meet the standards set by John Thomas. Robert Roberts had such an unhealthy obsession with John Thomas that he was blurring the line between religion and fan club. And so, yeah, he was mocked as an admirer of Thomas rather than someone who could think independently and critically about an issue himself. And while this is all fun and sassy and surprising to learn about, we're here today to talk about the other story I found hidden away in here, because there is an entire chapter about the members of this ecclesia practicing a form of hands-on energy healing called mesmerism. And while mesmerism was widely known during the Victorian era, mesmerism isn't a term most of us are familiar with in the present day. So let me give you some background about what it is before we dive into our main story today. Mesmerism was developed in the late 1700s by a Hungarian Jesuit priest named Maximilian Hell, yes, Hell, but it was named after a young scientist who promoted this idea named Franz Anton Mesmer. Mesmer promoted a belief that humans contained a magnetic fluid that could be manipulated to restore their health. He was also considered a plagiarist who took many of his ideas off of a man named Richard Mead. And yes, of course I was going to share that because I have no problem humbling dead old white man on this podcast. And as a fun fact, there is a movie from the 1990s called Mesmer, which features Alan Rickman as Franz Mesmer, so feel free to picture Alan Rickman as Franz during this episode. And as I dug into information on this, numerous sources pointed out the importance of the era that this idea came out in. And this is really relevant when you're considering why this theory became popular at the time. This was an era in which some people still believed that health was ruled by the four humors. It's an idea that many of us have heard about, where people believe that illness was caused by imbalances in blood, bile, poo, and phlegm, essentially, before we knew about microbes, viruses, sanitation, and other discoveries that form the basis for modern medicine. This idea was fading, but it was still an idea people were familiar with. Also, electricity was discovered around this time, with Ben Franklin's experiments starting in the mid-1700s. So other invisible forces were being discovered. Mesmer was also known to be influenced by the idea of gravity, and how gravity, another invisible force, was causing the tides. And after all, if gravity could affect water, why couldn't it also affect our bodies, which are full of water and apparently magnetic fluid? And so Franz Mesmer kind of built this pseudo-scientific idea into a framework that was pretty understandable to people at the time, and it seemed like it could be true since science was starting to learn about unseen forces around us like electricity and gravity during that period. So the idea was just that essentially imbalanced fluid in the body could be manipulated by magnets to restore health. At first, this meant that people swallowed bits of metal. Then Mesmer would move a magnet over their bodies because he didn't know how the digestive tract worked yet. And I guess magnetic fluid wasn't good enough for his magnets. I don't know. It was very weird. But that quickly evolved into clients holding metal rods or having magnets placed on different parts of their body. After that, it evolved again, and he was putting metal rods into giant baths, and people would sit around these bathtubs holding the rods, and that was basically Mesmer trying to scale up the practice so that he could heal groups of people instead of just one person at a time. One source also mentioned Mesmer would at one time mesmerize a tree and then have someone touch the tree, and a line of people would form holding hands with that person touching the tree to allegedly conduct the healing energy from person to person, starting with the tree. And honestly, at this point, it just sounds a lot like the belief in grounding, so I'm sure there's a wellness influencer actually just doing that in the present day. But yeah, the early versions of Mesmerism were kind of a little weird. And by now, you probably realize all of this magnet stuff is kind of how it earned its other name of animal magnetism, because of all the magnets and metal that was originally involved. But luckily for everyone, the use of the magnets and metal rods over time was falling by the wayside as people also pushed back on the magnetic fluid idea, and people also discovered that they could achieve the same results without the magnets. So after that, more and more people interested in mesmerism simply moved their hands up and down over the patient's body. And at that point, it also started to resemble hypnosis, and in fact, mesmerism is credited as the origin of hypnosis. As an aside about hypnosis, I did share a story about John Thomas hypnotizing someone in Season 1's episode on spiritualism, so feel free to listen to that if you want to know more about Christadelphians and hypnosis. But the intention of mesmerism was not to try to control people or influence their decisions, which are some things we might think of when we're thinking about hypnosis. Although it is true that some performances utilize the power of suggestion, and men would even make it appear that they were controlling women through their ability to mesmerize them. But if we go back to looking at the era where mesmerism came from, it also came out of a very brutal medical system that was dangerous, ineffective, and even cruel. And most importantly, the modern inventions that we take for granted today simply did not exist yet. That includes a very important discovery, namely anesthesia. If you've listened to the history episode on Dr. Thomas's medical qualifications, then you have heard me joke about the opium and alcohol he recommended to his patients as a treatment. But in all fairness, those were the common tools at their disposal for pain relief at that time. It wasn't until the late 1840s that anesthesia was discovered to render a patient safely unconscious for a medical procedure. So prior to that discovery, there was an understandable desire for a more ethical and effective alternative to things like alcohol and opium. And this was another important void that Mesmerism was trying to fill during this time period. Mesmerism became promoted as a free tool that allows the patient to go into a daze while undergoing surgery. One story from the article, The Brief and Strange History of Mesmerism and Surgery, describes how mesmerism was used to essentially cause the patient to go into what sounds like a hypnotic state before a surgery in 1829. The story goes that a surgeon removed a tumor, because yes, cancer has been around for a long time, while the patient was mesmerized. The patient not only didn't report any pain or discomfort, but they also had no recollection of the surgery when they allegedly fell out of the mesmerized state 2 days later. And so mesmerism began to be used in hospitals on patients in hopes that it would provide a benefit to patients, especially during surgery. It also seemed to show promise and was being studied as a possible treatment for epilepsy and seizures. And this makes sense. If anesthesia and other medications weren't invented, I'd totally be willing to have someone try to hypnotize or mesmerize me so I would experience less pain during a necessary operation or reduce the chance of having a seizure. However, by the late 1840s, when anesthesia began to be used in hospitals, it outperformed mesmerism, and mesmerism quickly fell out of favor among the scientific community. In fact, America's Ben fucking Franklin was recruited by King Louis XVI of France to scientifically investigate mesmerism to see if it was a true science or just a hoax. And so Franklin and other scientists who were tasked with the investigation tested it by having a partition separate the participant from the mesmerist. What they discovered was that there was basically no response from the participant when they couldn't see the mesmerist working. They also told the participant that the water they were drinking was mesmerized when it wasn't, and vice versa. And again, what they found was that the participant only had a strong reaction when they were told that the water was mesmerized, rather than when they were actually drinking the water that was exposed to mesmerism. So they were experiencing a placebo effect where they were reacting to the belief in mesmerism and not actually responding to the practice itself. So these rigorous scientific tests both debunked mesmerism and, as another interesting fact, led to the creation of the scientific standard of double-blind studies in scientific research. And despite the findings of Ben Franklin and the rest of the Royal Commission created by the King, mesmerism remained popular into the 1840s in Britain alongside vocal opposition by scientists at that time. And as it turns out, there's also a book called The Mesmerist by Wendy Moore, which documents the drama of The Lancet. They were initially publishing articles on mesmerism in The Lancet before changing course and publicly denouncing mesmerism a few years later. So there was a dramatic rise and fall around mesmerism in England during this time. So mesmerism was another widely debated, hot topic in Britain in the early years of the Christadelphians, just like spiritualism was. So it's understandable that early Christadelphians explored it, just like those Christadelphians who attended seances and spiritualist performances, which I've mentioned before on this podcast. Okay, so I think that's enough background so that I can start telling you our main story for today. So let's talk about how the Edinburgh Christadelphians first got interested in mesmerism. And fortunately, William's history is pretty comprehensive, so we'll start at the beginning and I'll read sections of it at a time because we're going to stop and discuss different parts of this as we go along. So let's start with William Norrie's history of how the Edinburgh Christadelphians first became interested in mesmerism. Quote, "A remarkable experience of the Edinburgh Church in the early years of its history was the manner in which the laying on of hands, or to express it in more purely scientific terms, the practice of mesmerism, was employed as a curative agent for many of the ills to which this mortal is subject. This experience was the more remarkable as it appeared to last for only a few years and subsequently was almost entirely unknown. It was just a week or two after the Edinburgh meeting was formed that two gentlemen, Messrs. Davy and Jackson, came on a professional visit to Edinburgh. Mr. W. Davy was a native of Devonshire, if I remember rightly, and was a powerful mesmerist, while his colleague, Mr. J. W. Jackson, who came from London, was a highly intellectual gentleman, an eloquent lecturer, and an expert in the science of phrenology. In personal appearance, he bore a considerable resemblance to Dr. Thomas, having a long and jet-black beard, which was arranged in glossy ringlets. His style of speech and his manner gave one the impression that he belonged to the order of seers and prophets. These two gentlemen, who made a specialty of curative mesmerism, had been lecturing and demonstrating very successfully in the south and east of England, and also in Ireland, and had founded a mesmeric infirmary in Dublin. Several members of the Edinburgh Church had their attention arrested by the novel announcement which Messrs. Davy and Jackson made of their arrival in the Scottish metropolis, and were desirous to know something about this extraordinary mode of treating disease, which these gentlemen were desirous of bringing before the public notice. Accordingly, 4 of us, James Cameron, John Foreman, James Watson, and I, took the liberty of waiting upon these gentlemen at their place of business and had a friendly talk with them. We found them very frank and intelligent in the 2 subjects that were their specialty, but rather disheartened at the seeming failure of their visit to Edinburgh so far. So dispirited were they, in fact, that they had all but decided to leave Edinburgh, as being a place so wholly given up to orthodoxy and orthodox ways that there seemed no chance for anyone who proposed a departure from the beaten path. To a small religious community like ours, which had just made so marked a divergence from the ordinary theological tract, and who were ever on the alert to hear of something new, there was a kind of fascination in the doctrine of healing by the laying on of hands as expounded and practically illustrated by these 2 gentlemen. James Cameron, in particular, who all through was the leading spirit in this movement, was most anxious that something should be done to bring a knowledge of the healing art under the notice of the public. As a result of this interview, arrangements were made for a public lecture with demonstrations on the art of curative mesmerism. This lecture was given in the Taylor's Hall, the meeting place of the Edinburgh Church, on the evening of Friday, May 6th, and it was so successful that on Saturday the 14th of the same month, the first meeting of a class for practical instruction in curative mesmerism was commenced. A number of the members of the Taylor's Hall meeting joined this class, and among its members also was Mr. Alexander Melville Bell, who has already been mentioned as one of Dr. Thomas's friends during his stay in Edinburgh, unquote. Okay, so there are a few things I want to point out from this section. Firstly, that this happened right after they formed their ecclesia, and then they really threw themselves into it by even hosting lectures for the public and presumably paying these men to teach mesmerism in their meeting hall, since apparently they did it professionally. And I cannot imagine any modern-day meeting hosting classes on energy healing in their halls, like, ever, or even supporting their members doing energy work in their meeting hall. So this is a pretty incredible story already. And secondly, their eagerness to hear something new is also remarkable. One thing that we find in Christadelphian history, but not in the modern-day Christadelphians as much, is this openness to new ideas. Because the belief system was still so new, all of the early members were adult converts who had left behind their former, usually pretty traditional and orthodox, or as they described it, ordinary, beliefs. And so they saw themselves as free thinkers who were thinking outside the box of the big religions of the day. These early believers were so excited about new ideas that they heard from John Thomas, but they were also excited about new ideas in general. While Robert Roberts became very close-minded, other Christadelphians at that time were very open-minded towards new ideas and saw themselves more so as radicals of the day. And I do find this so interesting because so much of Christadelphian culture today is about the preservation of the truth, like I talked about with Rob. Or new ideas are seen as a threat, like what I heard in my conversation with Steve when he was forced to take classes after sharing a different opinion that he had read about. And so much of Christadelphian culture today is just about holding on to the teachings of John Thomas, Robert Roberts, and other old white guys. And the slightest mention of change or something just less traditional, even just what musical instruments can be used to play an approved Christadelphian song, like Ben mentioned in his episode, can create an enormous pushback from the community. So Christadelphians today are known for their desire to maintain the status quo and uphold the traditions of their faith, essentially the exact opposite of this early ecclesia. And it's wild how it only took maybe a generation or two for Christadelphians to go from being eager individuals, alert to hear something new and embrace new ideas with curiosity and enthusiasm, to getting stuck in a really deep theological rut and starting to resemble the very people in churches that the early Christadelphians left and tried to distinguish themselves from. Somehow they went from radical, open-minded thinkers to the rigid upholders of tradition that they had sought to escape. I also love how they pointed out that one of the traveling mesmerism salesmen looked like John Thomas, not only because of those hot black ringlets in his beard, which we know John Thomas would have been vain about, and that Robert Roberts coveted and literally kept as a memento, but also just his demeanor, because in the Christadelphians episode, I shared stories where other people reported seeing Thomas the same way, as an intelligent man who seemed to speak in the manner of a prophet and who stood out because of his dark beard. The other guy, meanwhile, was not given a description at all, so I'm just going to assume that he also looks like Alan Rickman. So at this point, I'm basically picturing John Thomas and Alan Rickman teaching this ecclesia magic, which is very fun. All right, students, turn to page 394. You are here today to learn the subtle science and the exact art of mesmerism. So let's read more of this story to learn about how things went after the ecclesia participated in these classes on mesmerism. Quote, all the members entered very enthusiastically into the work, and some were able to produce some remarkable results in the way of cures of various ailments and in the relief of suffering in different forms. One of the earliest fruits of the labors of Messrs. Davy and Jackson was the formation of the Scottish Curative Mesmeric Association. It was instituted for the purpose of applying mesmerism gratuitously to the cure of disease and promoting its general use by all classes of the community. Professor Gregory, professor of chemistry in the University of Edinburgh, was the president. James Cameron was the secretary. Mr. A.B. Bell was one of the directors. And among the acting committee were 4 of the members of the Taylor's Hall meeting, named J. McDougall, J. Bannerman, W. Lang, and James Swinton. The association was from the first very successful in its treatment of disease. I have now before me a copy of the second annual report, in which a number of cases of cure are recorded, and among them I recognize one in which I was the operator. The patient was a friend of my sister Jane, who was the first to mesmerize her, but being unable to follow out the treatment, she handed the case over to me, the result being thus recorded. Anne Duncan, Haddington Place, Leith Walk, aged 24, about 5 months ago came to Edinburgh from Shetland for the purpose of obtaining medical treatment for epilepsy. She had been subject to fits for 7 years. They were at first occasioned by a violent fright and were afterwards induced by excitement. The fits generally lasted for 6 hours, during which the patient frequently spoke incoherently, and they always left her in a state of great exhaustion, sometimes accompanied with headache. She was also subject to fainting fits. An eminent physician in Edinburgh had been consulted by letter and had prescribed for the case, the medicine being sent from Edinburgh, but with no good result. The mesmeric treatment was commenced soon after her arrival in Edinburgh by the advice of some friends whom she consulted. She was mesmerized for about 2 months, for the first fortnight almost daily, but less frequently afterwards. The result was that she never had a fit after the mesmeric treatment was commenced, now upwards of 6 months ago, although on several occasions circumstances such as formerly used to cause fits have occurred, unquote. Once again, there's so much here, but I want to point out that this new association of mesmerism in Scotland was actually made up mostly of members of this ecclesia. Like, this group of early believers were incredibly involved in creating and supporting mesmerism, not only in their ecclesia, but also in the wider community. And also, Robert Roberts' wife, Jane Norrie, was specifically mentioned as being a practitioner of mesmerism, and I have heard some Australians say that they're descended from Robert and Jane's daughters, so some listeners are going to learn a fun fact about their great-great-great-grandmother here. Jane Roberts and her brother William had worked together to help this woman Anne with her epilepsy by treating her using mesmerism, and at times it started out literally every day, and I wasn't there to know anything beside what's recorded here, obviously, but that's great if Anne was able to live a healthier life after undergoing this hands-on healing. This is unfortunately all that's mentioned about that case, so it would be interesting to know how long these results lasted. It would be great to have a medical chart like we would in the modern day. But this is all that we have. It sounds impressive, even if scientifically speaking, it's not able to be substantiated regarding her diagnosis, her treatments, and so on. And honestly, even if it was a placebo effect, it sounds like they had good results. So it's still a positive, even if it wasn't caused by mesmerism, and even if it was just from Anne's belief in mesmerism. And again, since it sounds like modern medicine at that time was still pretty primitive and had failed her already, sure, why not try something that's pretty harmless and can even be beneficial? So let's read some more. Quote, "The utility of mesmerism as a curative agent was so palpably demonstrated in a variety of ways that it came to be recognized as a most valuable auxiliary in the art of restoring health, and the brethren were favored in having among their number several who were found to be powerful mesmerists. One of the most noted of these was James Swinton, whose success was so marked that he was induced to become a professional mesmerist, and in this capacity he afterwards removed to Great Malvern. There he got into a lucrative practice. As there were among the brethren and sisters several who were more or less of the character of invalids, scope was found for the efficient staff of mesmerists in affording temporary or permanent relief to them." In the third annual church report of 1856 to 1857, mention is thus made of the manner in which this curative agent was successfully employed in the case of Francis Renwick. "During the past year, there has been a marked improvement in the health of our brother F. Renwick, sufficient indeed to enable him to resume working to some extent from about the beginning of winter 1855 to 56. It is well to record that of the means apparently most beneficial towards his recovery, the laying on of hands has been the most marked. Thereby on several occasions one or other of the brethren has been enabled to invigorate his exhausted frame by the transmission of more healthy force. For this capability and these effects we are thankful to our Heavenly Father." Again, in the sixth annual report, 1858 to 1859, "The illness of these brethren and sisters has called forth the lively sympathy of the Church, which has found expression in monetary help where necessary, and the ministration of vital energy and soothing magnetism. In this latter, all the suffering ones have been partakers. The brethren are grateful to God for the acquirement of ability and skill to relieve the sufferings of their brethren in affliction by the laying on of their hands." Unquote. Honestly, I have to agree with Robert Roberts. These sound like excellent people in a very nice ecclesia. Earlier in the book, William mentioned that everyone was on pretty similar economic footing, but here we can see that their support for their members went beyond money and financial support for each other. They showed love and the physical support by literally using this loving touch to help soothe, energize, and heal their fellow members. Like, that just sounds so sweet. Like, just imagine a young brother or sister going up to one of the older or disabled members of your church and sitting with them and sending them thoughts and feelings of love and support to them. That sounds so sweet. And that was what was happening in this meeting. And this was something that was widely embraced by their members and documented as part of their annual reports. So they were taking this extremely seriously, and it was part of this ecclesia's culture. But William does mention that not every single member was open to this. So next we'll read about what people in the meeting who opposed the practice thought about it. Quote, "The new curative agent was not cordially welcomed by all the brethren. Andrew Tate was one who did not take kindly to it. He had a strong impression that the warnings in the prophets against seeking to wizards, those who had familiar spirits, and such as were said to peep and mutter, was applicable to persons who had dealings with this new-fangled nostrum. And he was not backward in expressing this opinion when the occasion seemed to him to demand it. In spite of his opposition, however, the art continued to be very successfully practiced by both the brethren and the sisters. A great sufferer, who had experienced the benefit of this valuable adjunct to health, was very much pained to hear of it spoken as impious, and she straightway made a gentle but vigorous protest against such an application of the opprobrious epithet. Her protest took the form of a poetical vindication of mesmerism," unquote. And yeah, she basically pulled a Kendrick Lamar at this guy and was like, if he's going to throw shade at mesmerism, I'm going to throw some sick rhymes back at him. And I'll just read the first two lines because it's kind of a long poem. But if you want to read the full poem, I'm happy to email it to you, or you can find the link to this document in the show notes of this episode to just go read it yourself. The first two lines are, quote, Call not the gift unholy, 'tis a fair and precious thing, that God hath granted to our hands for gentlest ministering. Unquote. So it's a lovely poem about God giving the ecclesia this gift of healing. They also wrote a song called Hymn of Health about hands-on healing, which I will also skip reading today. But if you or someone else is more musically inclined like Ben and you want to set the lyrics to music, I'll happily share that on our podcast social media, but I don't even know how to sing it, so I'm not even going to try. So William then shares about how the Edinburgh ecclesia decided to publicly share their interest in hands-on healing with other early ecclesias. And I'm going to read the full article they sent out, so bear with me because this part's kind of long. William records, quote, "The benefits derived from the mesmeric treatment of disease were found to be so marked in the case of the Edinburgh ecclesia that it was deemed desirable to call the attention of the other churches of baptized believers of the gospel of the kingdom in all parts of the country to the matter, that they might also participate in its advantages. With this view, a circular upon the subject was prepared by George Dowie, submitted to the church, approved of by them, and afterwards sent to the various churches by being inserted, such as a message from the Edinburgh Church, in number 2 of the manuscript, Messenger of the Churches, issued in July 1858. It was as follows: There is a matter of some importance to the well-being of all, which, although generally kept out of view in our search after the things of a future life, is not to be lost sight of. We mean the doctrine of health. The most superficial thinker is aware that not only is the physical enjoyment of the present life enhanced by the possession of good health, but that the mental perceptions and general tone of character are affected to a very great extent by it. The truth is woven into our language, coloring in our idiom with such phrases as good-humored, clear-headed, choleric, splenetic, etc. We do not disregard the voice of universal experience. Again, the reasonable interference from the sanitary appointments of the law of Moses is that God intended these to minister for good in all respects to the people of Israel. But as Christians, the duty is doubly ours to attend to the nourishing of our natural life in such a style as to elicit all its real utilities and enjoyments, and that when, through inheritance, infection, or accident, we find the body in sickness, debility, or pain, it is our duty to remove these and, as far as possible, restore the system to health. It should not be forgotten that, although the mission of Jesus of Nazareth was to announce the glad tidings of the kingdom of God in its immortal and incorruptible phase, yet he invited the sick, the blind, the halt, the demoniac, the lunatic, to receive the immediate blessings of health which flowed from him to bless them all. That furthermore his apostles, not only when acting as mere heralds of the Christ of Nazareth, but when endowed with power from on high for their own set mission to preach the gospel to every creature, carried with them and also imparted to others a reviving power to heal the diseased in all places. The spiritual gift of healing was of no lower rank than that of tongues or governments. This exhibition to the mercy of God to mortal flesh is worthy of our regard, as showing that the teacher of the most transcendent truths and most exalted hopes should have a sympathy for the evil fortunes of common life, and exercise himself to alleviate all its distresses. Perhaps this may be deemed too long a plea for so manifest a matter, but we quote these things to demonstrate not only the general questions, but the special duty of the disciples to exercise themselves for the preservation and restoration of health in their own persons and those of others. In our own day, there prevails a conservatism of several duties which properly should be exercised by all. We are familiar with the monopoly of ecclesiastical teaching, which obtains among the sects, and we decry it. If we can with any success supplant or render quite unnecessary the assumed prerogative of the clergy, why should we not question the monopoly of the physic? This may perhaps be deemed too bold a step, but a little consideration will show how practicable it is. As far as the preservation of health is concerned, there is a general intelligence abroad which it were culpable in the highest degree to be ignorant of. Cleanliness, temperance in all appetites, industry, calmness of mind, etc., are known to be efficient preservatives of good health, and in most cases, dietetic change, salubrity of residence, and the simplest medicines serve to recall the tone of health when it is invariably vitiated. Nay, even in cases of the most virulent nature, whether epidemic or endemic, the confident application of cold water to the skin or skillfully selected herbs to the stomach have proved generally efficient as restoratives. On these points, it seems well for everyone to have a simple but entire comprehension of the general nature of his physical system and its most likely ailments, with the particular effects which certain remedies are found uniformly to produce. We are far from advocating such intense study of these things as some have given them, well knowing that too much attention bestowed upon any organ of the body is calculated not only to excite morbid sensations in that particular part, but to induce actual disease. This extreme, however, is quite avoidable. But there is another method of cure, or at least of alleviation, to which we wish to direct your attention, concerning which we speak with the confidence of experience, for many of us practice it, and many more have experienced the benefit of its dispensation. We have learned that every healthy person has a power to bless his fellow men by a communication of his health to those who are distressed. That as there is sometimes a contagion of disease from contact of bodies, there is certainly a contagion of health through the same means. This is most copiously eliminated and transmitted through the hands. When, therefore, anyone lays his hands on another passive person, observing as a general rule that the right hand be laid on the left side and the left hand on the right side of the patient, covering as far as possible with one or both hands the part affected, in a short time a vital current is established through the region laying between the extremities of the operator's hands. This reversion of polarity or sides tends to augment the natural intensity of the vital influence. In most cases, an agreeable tingling sensation is experienced in the part operated upon, although sometimes the pain is intensified, as if all its virulence were aroused previous to its departure. When the case is one of weakness rather than pain, care should be taken not to allow the current to be too strong, disagreeably strong. A partial withdrawal of the hands will qualify it to any extent desired. We find also that almost every case of pain may be alleviated by another healthy person stroking with his hand downwards over the part affected, those strokes or passes being made in contact when the pain is not too severe on the surface, or at short distance when it is. The intervention of the clothing does not much matter. Care should be taken in bringing up the hands again to turn the backs of them towards the patient, or to keep them at a distance, that the current thus established may not be reversed by the upward motion. If the pain is very acute, as in toothache, headache, or severe rheumatism, an advantage is gained by using exertion, as if drawing the pain out, making the passes towards the nearest angle, joint, or extremity of the body, or to the head of a sore. After the pain is removed, which may generally be expected within half an hour, gentle breathing on the place will prevent its return. As far as practicable, the above directions regarding polarity should be attended to in those strokes and passes, and in breathing upon any part, the precaution should be taken to withdraw the mouth to inhale fresh air, turning the head from the patient. There is a danger of the acting hand being infected with the pain of the part operated upon. Consequently, the necessity for occasionally blowing upon it or shaking it in the air as if to disperse the morbid aura which may be hanging about it, and after the operation is done, the hands should be washed with cold water. Everyone essaying to be a healer should study to observe personal cleanliness and all the other conditions of health already alluded to. For all derangements of the nervous system, no remedy seems to be so efficient as this. When a general nervous irritation is experienced, it may almost always be soothed by long passes being made down the whole body without contact. Thus, the vexationness incident to teething may be soothed, and the general disposition quieted. Soothing passes and breathing made on a burn or scald will accelerate its cure. Whitlow may be dispersed, even in its earlier stages, by drawing passes. Toothache sometimes removed in a few minutes by the laying on of hands. Paralysis cured by daily or twice-a-day applications of long passes. Falling sickness or epilepsy has always a ready tendency to fall asleep under the gaze of the eye, and passes made on the face and head. This coma or sleep is the proper restorative in such a case. Insanity, as it arises from incessant restlessness of the brain, may frequently be removed by repeated applications of the soothing passes, and so of many other cases. The greatest care must be taken to avoid the infections above referred to. The means before stated will be found sufficient in ordinary cases, but if it appears that the operator is always and permanently affected with those pains he seeks to alleviate, this must be taken as a very sure indication that he should discontinue the practice. Not men alone, but women also may employ themselves to advantage in the ways of healing as above directed. Of course, their patients should be principally or entirely of their own sex or children. The man or woman thus essaying to heal should have general good health, a robust constitution is preferable, and at the time of operating must have no temporary affection, as thus he needs all the energy he has for his own recovery and could not benefit the patient. After every heavy operation, it is desirable to spend some time in the open air to invigorate and refresh the wasted energies. The power thus possessed is increased, and the well-disposed person enriched by the means which minister to the increase of all good. Thus, by communicating to others, his own power to bless is increased, and God is not unmindful of the prayer of him who entreats for power to heal and who desires preservation from infection. We hope, beloved brethren, that you will give good heed to this matter. As we have before stated, we speak from considerable experience, both as givers and receivers of the blessing. We give witness that this thing we do and those ends we seek, through the blessing of God our Father, and desire that we may show forth the praises of him who is worthy of all honor and majesty and dominion and might. Hallelujah! Unquote. This is so wild for me to hear, but honestly, it seems well-intentioned, so I really give them credit for being not only transparent about it, but giving instructions for anyone else who wants to try energy healing. They clearly believed in the value of this and wanted to share it in a democratic way. One thing that sticks out to me is also that this is the first and only time I've heard of Christadelphians preaching this doctrine of health. I remember hearing the verse about not caring for this life and what you should eat and what you should wear. Some other ex-Christadelphians remember the verse being mentioned about bodily exercise profiteth little. So modern Christadelphian teachings almost seem to encourage neglect of the body if we're talking about views on health, which makes this contrast to these original Christadelphians in Edinburgh so surprising. But they do make some good points that Jesus and his apostles were healing and did laying on of hands. So I guess technically it's a Bible-based teaching then. Also, they appropriately encourage men to practice on men and women on women to avoid men wanting an excuse to touch women or women improperly touching a man when social rules said that that's not ideal. They also didn't restrict the participation of women, so I love to see that little bit of feminism in this early ecclesia. And since the ecclesia shares the specifics of what they were doing and why, we can see that they were not practicing old school mesmerism with its magnets and baths and whatnot. No, they were practicing hands-on energy healing. And despite calling it mesmerism and believing that they were creating a circuit of energy because there was that belief in polarity there, it honestly begins to look a lot more like other forms of energy healing that we still have around today. Like, I think we could safely say that this would be like a Christadelphian ecclesia today embracing Reiki healing and sending a letter to the Christadelphian magazine to be published for everyone to read about how they use that in their ecclesia. And one thing that makes this so funny to me too is, you know who else does energy healing at their church services? You know who? The spiritualists. And the irony of that is just so funny to me because I already did a whole episode about how the Christadelphians hate spiritualism, and then here they are doing something which overlaps with spiritualists. And this is probably also a good time to share my own stories about energy healing, which is part of why this topic stood out to me as I was scrolling through literally hundreds of pages of history when I was reviewing this source. And yeah, I don't think anyone is necessarily surprised that I would have stories about energy experiences if you've been listening to past podcast episodes. So I, as you know, believe that humans and potentially other living things have some sort of energy because I've personally had experiences with ghosts and energetic communication from them. So that's already made me more open-minded about invisible energy, we'll say. And again, I don't require anyone else to hold that belief, but I'm just sharing that it is my own personal belief based on my own personal experiences. And as more background, I feel like I'm a fairly open-minded but also logical person. In fact, I was a science major when I was at university, so I actually have a wide educational background in the sciences. So I was learning about microbiology, chemistry, biology, ecology, physics, genetics, statistics, like all of that kind of stuff. And I've already shared that I'm up to date with my vaccinations and supportive of modern science. But of course, on top of that, I have lived experiences around energy. I have physically heard things that weren't there when a ghost was manifesting. And so sound is a form of energy. And so I believe that there's some energetic component to hauntings and spirits. But after having those spooky energy experiences, I also, which I don't think I've mentioned on that podcast at all, but I also, and I don't think I've mentioned this on the podcast at all, booked a Reiki session with my medium friend who I've mentioned before, which was interesting. And later I took Reiki classes myself. So I am actually also a level 2 certified Reiki practitioner. And that's essentially the minimum certification to be able to do energy work on other people in the area where I am. So the teacher I worked with does train to level 4, so I'm not all the way up there, didn't go all the way, but I did train in basically the basics of it. And even that experience was kind of wild. And again, this is subjective information, but I remember literally rocking back and forth because I was feeling energy like pulsing and flowing so much through me. And we were also practicing it on other people. So it was interesting to see if the person you are practicing with could feel what area you're working on, because they would have their eyes closed the whole time and you would practice giving them energy and they would give you feedback. And when you switched and you were on the table, you did the same thing and you practiced sensing energy from another person. And after that, I also attended a one-day class on another type of healing energy work with a different instructor. And as we discovered, which is not unusual, I was the only one in the class who had had energy experiences like this as usual. And so I was chatting with another student before the class started, and they had said, like, I don't know if I really believe in this stuff. I've never experienced anything like that, but I'm open to trying it. And so again, after the demonstration, we would sit behind our partners. They laid down with their eyes closed. And I close my eyes, I start practicing. And a few minutes later, I noticed something feels different. So I opened my eyes, and sure enough, the teacher sat on the opposite side of the person I was working on and was directing energy towards me as I worked on that person as well. And I could feel the teacher's energy. And it wasn't like, oh, like I sensed someone watching me. No, like I could feel the sensations of their energy coming to me through this person's body. And so it was interesting to me that I knew that I was feeling energy from another person. And when I talked to that student afterwards, who I talked with before, they said they didn't feel anything at all. So, like, clearly it's not an exact science. Like, do I have a receptor for it and that person doesn't? Is it something with me that's wired differently? Is it something that is turned off with them? Like, I don't know. And I'm curious. Like, I love it if science was able to research it and explain these things. I would totally read about that. But I also know there's an army of people willing to scream, it's all fake, they're all lying, it's not true, blah, blah, blah. But like, just stay curious. Because even with me, like, I can't always feel it with everyone. And sometimes I can, and I don't understand why sometimes it's not as much as other times. And what is also clear is that it's different for different people. And it was just like with these Christadelphians. One of them was so talented that they did it professionally, while there was that other guy in the ecclesia that said, oh, I don't believe in it, and I think it's witchcraft, blah, blah, blah. But in a way, they're kind of potentially both right, because the one guy's clients can be having real experiences feeling this energy. He is really giving them energy. So it's true. But the other guy may not feel it and may not get any benefit. So for him, it's not real because he didn't feel anything and he didn't see it. So there's this subjective element to it where it's all based on what the person feels, which they can't really measure. Another time, a friend invited me to a pagan ritual that was being hosted by a massage therapist and energy healer. And of course, I was like, sure, I'll go do witchcraft with the girlies. So I show up to this massage studio, which has like this little shop in the front full of crystals and tarot cards and that sort of stuff. And I know I'm definitely in the right place. So we head into a little room, and everyone that's participating is given a script to reference during this. So the woman who owns the massage place leads this, And then at different points, we would all stand and chant together in unison and pray to the ancient gods. Honestly, after having been a Christian and having to stand and sing to an ancient sky god every Sunday, it wasn't that weird. And this time I got to be part of communication to a god that was a woman instead of a guy, so that was actually cool. But I remember at both the first and second ritual that I attended, shortly after we started and while we were standing there doing our chanting and stuff together, I started to feel Reiki energy and I could feel it start flowing through me. And what's weird was that wasn't part of the ceremony. And although the massage therapist leading this had that certification and they do practice Reiki professionally, that wasn't actually like mentioned or an intention of this ritual. But I will say that Reiki energy always feels really pleasant to me. So I did enjoy that. It was like this pleasant tingling in my hands, but also this calmness in my overall energy and a sense of feeling really connected to like the earth and the world around me. So overall, it just feels really nice. And I noticed that I was feeling this healing energy during this ritual. And so I asked one of the co-owners of the massage studio another time why they thought that I would be feeling this Reiki energy while I was there. And they just smiled at me and said, "It's the spirits." And you know what? That's on me for asking, because I wanted like a logical answer, like, oh, well, it's because of this. But I wanted a reason to something that isn't defined by science. So that wasn't going to happen. But that was just another interesting energy experience that I had, but also kind of maybe more evidence for that guy in the Edinburgh ecclesia who was not a fan of mesmerism because he's like, that's witchcraft. And I'm like, well, maybe they do go together, at least in my experience. But, it was fun. Why not do witchcraft? For me, I know that the Christadelphian ideology isn't true. It doesn't hold up in my view. So why not explore the opposite of it and look into all the things that they said weren't true and just see for myself? And maybe there's something to what they said about the spirits, because it seems like there's a correlation where mediums are more likely to be energy healers. The people who run this massage place host psychic events monthly, so for them, it is certainly the case. And energy healing is also part of spiritualist culture, which emphasizes mediumship. So in my experience, those without psychic ability and mediumship experiences tend to also not believe or feel this sort of energy either. So maybe it is the spirits somehow, because it seems like there's at least a correlation between energy healing and mediumship abilities. Like if we were talking about radios, I'd be asking if they're both on the same frequency, because it seems like they're linked. So they're both being felt, or if we're talking about radios, being heard together. And it would be awesome to know if the Christadelphian who became a professional mesmerist was also a medium, but nothing's recorded about that in this source, so we don't know if it's the case. It just seems like it's probably a possibility. And I have one more story. So as I mentioned before, the spiritualist church in my area starts their Sunday church services with hands-on healing before the talk and before the demonstrations of mediumship. So one morning, I'm running around getting ready because it's a bit of a drive. I also don't go all the time because, again, bit of a drive. And all of a sudden that morning, I get a pain in my neck. Like, that feeling where it hurts to turn your neck to one side? That was what happened. So whatever, I need to get to the services as I planned. And so I'm like, okay, afterwards, I'll stretch, I'll hydrate, whatever. I'll deal with my muscle when I get home. Try not to change lanes too much while I'm driving. It'll be fine. But every time I go up front when they say, hey, it's time for the energy healing part, whatever. And I've been a number of times, and each time you sit in front of a random person because there's a number of different people who go up to do the healing, and it changes every time depending on who's there. So whoever has a spot open in front of them, you can go up to them. They will ask for your consent to put their hands on your shoulders, and then you just sit there quietly. It's honestly really calming. It's meditative. And most of the times I go, I have no idea if it's doing anything because I don't really notice a difference. But that day, when I had that neck pain, that time, I sat down in front of this nice lady. She puts her hands on my shoulders, and I shit you not, I feel heat. And it's not like I'm feeling the heat everywhere. I am feeling it specifically in that muscle that really hurt when I was leaving to get there. And so I sit there in front of her for a few minutes, and I'm feeling this heat just going straight to my neck. And I'm just quietly sitting there like, did she really figure out that I have this pain in my neck? Because I didn't say anything to her besides, like, yes, you can put your hands on my shoulders, and gave her consent. We don't have a conversation. It's quiet. It's kind of like an interlude. Like there's music playing and everyone's quiet, like meditating. But she honed right in on it, clearly. And sure enough, my neck felt so much better afterwards. And again, also, I just like to throw out there, this was completely free. These were volunteers performing this at the church services. So it wasn't like someone was waving their hands around doing a show and they've got people in the audience planted and they're pretending they have an ability and trying to make money off of you. Like, this was very legitimate. And the church trains and approves of these volunteers for the energy work section of the service. But, like, I have no idea would that have happened if I was with another energy healer. Like, I'm not going to pull a muscle again just to test it out. So, like, my point is that it resists experimentation and measurement. But subjectively, I have had experiences where I'm like, oh, I was, like, healed by this energy healing from this person. And that was all they did, was put their hands on me, and they were directing energy into me to heal. And so I can't scientifically prove energy healing, but based on my personal experiences, I will say, in my opinion, there's something to it. Do with that what you will. I don't care. And again, I wouldn't say that I've had any experiences with mesmerism specifically, but definitely with spiritualists who laid their hands on my shoulders. But honestly, the spiritualists laying their hands on my shoulders sounds a lot closer to what the early Christadelphians were doing than the form of mesmerism as shared by Franz Mesmer, aka Alan Rickman. And, personally at this point, if I got sick, I would still take medicine, I would still rest, I would consult with my doctors. But would I say no to a reputable energy worker? Probably not. Like, sure, it could be helpful. It's pretty low risk for contraindications. So it's like a supplement to health. And I know the majority of listeners probably won't relate to my experiences, but I really don't think what I experienced and believe is any stranger than Christadelphian teachings. Christadelphians spent years telling me that Christ, a guy who died over 2,000 years ago, is still alive somewhere, would return any second. Then he would use God's magic or whatever to literally raise the dead, and then transport the living and formerly dead people that he likes to Israel and make them all immortal now. Which I feel like are kind of a lot of weird beliefs that are all not grounded in our physical reality. You've got necromancy, you've got immortality, you've got magic. So yeah, that Christadelphian who was like name calling these mesmerists saying that they're necromancers was also a believer in Christadelphian teachings, and they're praying that their necromancer will return today to raise the dead. Double standard much? Like, come on. And since we're talking about energy healing today, I just felt it was relevant to share my thoughts on my own experiences to give more depth to this conversation. I think there's a reason these beliefs in the afterlife and energy have endured for so long, that they show up in cultures around the world, and they still continue to persist into the modern day, whereas so many other things that are considered pseudoscience, think about the phrenology that was mentioned in today's episode, have fallen by the wayside. I am still shocked that at one point these beliefs actually made it into an ecclesia's culture and their doctrinal beliefs. But based on my experiences, I kind of understand why. And I don't think they would have continued to practice this for years if they hadn't had some real results. I think if they hadn't had a real result and seen a benefit in their, patients, at least some of the time, then they would have given it up, because that would have been a waste of time. It was taking at least half an hour, they were saying. So why spend a half an hour every week doing something without it benefiting either of you? But as someone who has been able to feel energy flowing through me to someone else, and feel energy flowing through someone else to help me reduce my pain, I can say that both those experiences are really cool and would encourage me to keep doing those things and to believe in it and want to spend the time on it. So I personally think that some of these people, at least, could actually do energy work, and that's why it lasted as long as it did in the ecclesia. Again, take from that what you will. Okay, so those are my energy stories, at least for now. And what that means is that it's time to get back to the Edinburgh ecclesia, because we still have just a little bit more left in this chapter to talk about. So the ecclesia published that article, a little lengthy, but okay, about how to do energy work and their view that the practice is actually scripturally sound. So now let's get to the conclusion of our story today. William wrote, quote, I am not aware that any of the churches were induced to adopt the practice of curative mesmerism in consequence of this warm recommendation and these lucid instructions. By the time the foregoing circular was issued, the mesmeric treatment had been gaining ground with the general public, though it never came to be popular. It is rather singular also that from the time of this address to the brethren, the practice of curative mesmerism began to fall off, and soon afterwards was entirely discontinued. Why so useful an art was given up, I never understood." Unquote. And that's the end of the chapter. Like, William, what? This is such a disappointing conclusion. And William, you were there. You were literally one of the energy workers at the ecclesia. Like, can you at least share why you stopped doing it? Can you give me some hints about like why you think they stopped? But that's where this ends. And there's a footnote, but it's not even particularly useful. The only part that stuck out to me was this, quote, "Nearly all the medical periodicals are violently, almost fanatically opposed to mesmerism," unquote. So like, did it decline because society at large was losing interest in mesmerism? Like, I don't think so necessarily, because already at this point it was the 1850s. Mesmerism, as I said earlier, was debunked way back in 1784, and then it had another significant hit to its reputation after the discovery of anesthesia in the mid-1840s. So the ecclesia embraced mesmerism decades after Ben Franklin's experiments disproved Mesmer's methods, at least, and after the scientific community had turned on mesmerists in Britain. And clearly they were aware of its opposition based on this footnote, but they didn't seem to be particularly influenced by that. And after all, this ecclesia was founded in 1853, and these early Christadelphians began their training within weeks of the ecclesia's founding. And based on the annual reports mentioned, the energy healing lasted at least through 1859, 1860-ish. And yeah, you probably forgot all those dates I mentioned during the episode, but you never know when having a timeline will come in handy. And I kept looking at dates to try to come up with other ideas for why this practice of mesmerism fell out of favor at this ecclesia so quickly. And at that time specifically, despite it being rooted in this community since its inception as an ecclesia. So one thing I wondered was whether they received any negative feedback from their article, because that was published in 1859 and it fell out of practice in the following year and a half or so. But I would suspect that any drama from that letter would have been memorable enough for William to include that in his history, and it doesn't appear to have been a rapid decline where like a bunch of arranging brothers swooped in like birds of prey to shame little old ladies asking for relief from their arthritis or whatever, because they did include it in annual reports the following year, so it was still around, didn't just immediately go away. But there was one interesting event that happened in 1859, so maybe that is the big event that was tied to this change. And I mentioned what it was earlier in this episode, so shout it out if you know it. Yes, out loud at your desk where you're listening. It was the wedding of Miss Jane Norrie to a Mr. Robert Roberts, because within a year of Robert Roberts marrying into someone in this community, they stopped practicing energy work. Coincidence? Okay, I honestly, I don't know. And I will tell you why. Let me share with you another story. In Robert Roberts' autobiography, My Days and My Ways, he writes about one memorable experience he had. Quote, "The only other thing of any interest that I remember at this time was the advent to the town of a mesmeric lecturer of the name of Smalley, since dead. His power over people was extraordinary. Being connected with a public paper, I naturally came into contact with him and had occasion to become aware of the reality of the power he possessed. I was in the same house one evening, taking tea with some friends of his, and on passing behind my chair, without any previous notice, he passed his hand down my back, with the effect of imparting a shock that made me cry out. It was exactly like the shock of a galvanic battery. He had a power of drawing people from the audience by clutching the air with his hands towards them. Some thought it was collusion, or at least a willingness on the part of his subjects. I was determined to test this. And being with him alone in a large room in New Street, I went to the other end of the room and defied him to produce any effect on me. He accepted the challenge and went to work. I resisted him with all my might. I felt his influence from the first wave of his hand, but kept it off for a time. At every stroke, the power of the influence increased until finally it was irresistible, and I was drawn to him with a power as great as if he had pulled me by a rope tied around my middle, unquote. Also, that last line is a great line to use in your Robert Roberts fanfic. Alone in a room, and he's irresistible, and I'm drawn to him. And using Robert Roberts' cryptic hints here because he included the story out of order in his biography and couldn't just put a date on it. This appears to have happened in 1863. So that would be 3 years or so after the Edinburgh Church stopped practicing mesmerism. And the interesting thing about that to me is both that it tells us that Robert Roberts did not believe in mesmerism before this experience because he yelled at this man to defy him, probably assuming that he would easily prove that the man was a fraud. But it's also interesting that this memory of being disproven stuck with him enough to include in his memoir, but he never says anything like, oh yeah, my wife and my family can do that too. But sadly, this experience did not seem to cause absolutely any change in his beliefs or impart humility on him or anything. I do kind of wish the Smalley guy had been a Christadelphian though, because can you imagine that show going down at the ecclesia and this guy uses invisible force to pull Robert Roberts in close? So one possible theory that I thought of is maybe the people at the ecclesia gave up mesmerism for appearances when Robert Roberts was visiting, because after all, I already shared with you today how extremely volatile Robert Roberts was about anything that wasn't following the standards set by John Thomas. And it seems that he did not have any mesmeric experiences prior to 1863. The letter written by George Dowie that they published and sent to the other churches also said near the beginning that their practice of mesmerism was, quote, generally kept out of view, unquote. So that seems to indicate that this wasn't necessarily openly practiced in front of others. So if that's the case, then maybe the Edinburgh Christadelphians just fell out of their routine from having to skip it whenever Roberts came to visit. Like anyone with ADHD is probably nodding along like, yeah, once you skip your routine once, it's gone forever. It doesn't exist anymore. So like maybe that's possible and would explain like why it sort of faded out without any conflict. Or like maybe the members who had been receiving mesmeric treatments moved away or they died or something, so there was less need for it. Like that's just another idea. But I also wonder like how could this ecclesia have hidden it from Robert Roberts, especially because they literally published this manifesto about how great energy healing is. And in Robert's autobiography, he does mention that he and John Thomas had read articles from this publication, The Messenger of the Churches, in 1867. So presumably they read earlier editions. I also found that John Thomas reprinted an article from the Edinburgh Messenger of Churches in his 1860 edition. So they had access to that to know what was going on. But Robert Roberts was also young at this time, so he didn't have his platform of editor of the Christadelphian magazine yet. So when I thought about that, I was like, well, John Thomas was still editing and publishing his Herald of the Kingdom and Age to Come during that era. So I did a review of the 1858 edition, and I did find a few small comments in the May 1858 edition specifically on mesmerism, although that would have been 2 months before their pro-mesmerism article was published, so it wouldn't have been in response to it necessarily. But some of the little comments that John Thomas published were, quote, "In all sober sadness, we cannot but deplore the folly of our fellow men. What folly to imagine that it can be taught and obtained in the mesmeric contortions of excitability and animal feeling. What fanaticism to suppose that the exciting action operating on the weak nerves of silly people like mesmerism or necromancy can have any effect. This is not the religion taught by the Sermon on the Mount," unquote. So, John Thomas was clearly opposed to it and published that in his magazine, which would have been read by members of the Edinburgh ecclesia. So maybe they were influenced by John Thomas's writings and felt some sense of shame that made them want to give it up. But I will say that John Thomas loved throwing punches in his writing, so I'm actually surprised that I didn't find like a rant in there specifically mentioning this ecclesia and its engagement in mesmerism at the ecclesia. And right when you think, well, if John Thomas didn't shut it down, then Robert Roberts must have shut it down, just like he shut down people refusing to get baptized a second time, he didn't seem to. And the story he shares about his own experience with mesmerism is sort of a clue, because he doesn't share any knowledge or opinions of mesmerism being practiced at the Edinburgh ecclesia at all, despite dating and marrying Jane right around that time. And then, given his experience years later in his autobiography, it seems like that was his first time he experienced what they call mesmerism firsthand. But how could that be if they were doing mesmerism at the ecclesia? Like, clearly he had visited the ecclesia and knew these members, so it's strange that he acts like this is a brand new thing years later. Like, did he know? Did he not know? It's just a little confusing. And it seems like, if anything, he learned that it was real when he was exposed to it. And the other thing I was thinking about, just as, again, a theory, trying to hypothesize why this went away so fast, was I was like, okay, well, what time did the ecclesia get disfellowshipped? But it was 7 years after they stopped doing energy healing, so that doesn't really seem to be related. And just as a side note for all of you listeners, this group of Christadelphians was formally disfellowshipped from the group that became the Central Christadelphians. And one researcher of Christadelphian splits indicated that this group at Edinburgh continued to retain their original name for a period, but it seems that they dissolved at some point and rejoined other churches. So I don't know if there are any current Christadelphians who are related to people mentioned in this episode from that old ecclesia. However, I have heard that the modern Christadelphian ecclesia in Edinburgh has a progressive reputation, so it's possible they have this spirit of embracing new ideas anyways. And I will also say that calling what they were doing as mesmerism just doesn't sound quite right. By this point, decades after Mesmer was discredited, this method had evolved into something resembling more like the modern day Reiki and energy healing than the 1700s mesmerism with magnets and trees and bathtubs. So it seems to be more about energy healing and more about like other ancient ideas. Because ideas around energetic life force have been around for thousands of years. Think about the Qi in Qigong or prana in Ayurveda. Many cultures have had some form of energy healing and beliefs around this. So it kind of feels like mesmerism was just a failed rebranding of an old idea, maybe. And I'm not an expert in other cultures and haven't done like specific research on all of these topics at depth. But I think it's accurate to say that even if mesmerism, as practiced by Alan Rickman, Franz Mesmer, wasn't real, that doesn't mean that the energy healing by the early Christadelphians in Edinburgh wasn't real. And who's to say what's real or not? I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'm just here to teach you some fun history about the Christadelphians. So maybe by now you understand why I've been thinking about this story for like 2 years now and wanted to share it with you in today's episode, because I think it's super interesting just on its own, because who's ever heard of a Christadelphian doing energy healing, especially when it's so associated with their sworn nemesis, the spiritualists? But also, why did they stop practicing energy healing all of a sudden? It's also just a mystery. And I keep wondering, like, what really happened? What influenced them to give it up? And unfortunately, I don't have a solid answer where I can definitively prove what it was. But now you also get to think about this and wonder about it just like I do. And that brings us to the end of season 3. Thank you for tuning in, and feel free to send me any other clues you find, your fan theories, your fan fiction, your energy stories, or just tell me what you thought about this season of the podcast. I do really enjoy hearing from you. Also, your reviews, likes, and shares really do help the podcast. So why not send this episode to a person you think would be most likely to do energy healing at your old ecclesia and blow their mind? And for anyone who is interested in our statistics, this season alone since September, we've released over 24 hours of content by ex-Christadelphians. We have also now had listeners in 37 countries and have had over 15,000 episode downloads since the podcast was initially released last fall. So thank you to everyone who has shared their story, their expertise, and their support. This podcast wouldn't be here without the support of the ex-Christadelphian community. So for the next few weeks, I'm going to be taking a break from the podcast, but I will be checking emails and, of course, reading about Christadelphian history. So feel free to email me if you're interested in coming on the show to share your story, if you want to share your expertise on a relevant topic, or if you want to join me in researching and presenting another topic on the podcast. Just send me an email at lifeafterleavingpodcast@gmail.com to get in touch with me. So that's all for today. I hope you are feeling inspired to live your truth, and stay tuned for our next episodes in 2026. Until then, bye everyone. Thank you to everyone who has helped make this episode of the podcast possible. Today's episode was edited by me, Zinnia. I'd also like to thank Al Kroons for creating our intro music and the ex-Christadelphians that submitted audio for the intro music. If you'd like to join our community, you can find us at the group for ex-Christadelphians on Facebook. You can also follow our social media on Facebook and Instagram at Life After Leaving Podcast. If you'd like to come on the podcast, reach out to me at lifeafterleavingpodcast@gmail.com. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a rating and review or sharing this podcast with a friend. That's all for today. Thanks, and see you next time.